Hello and welcome to my channel. I am Zodiac Bandit, and today we have some spoilers for Campaign 3 of Critical Role, and we also have some potential spoilers just for the future of Critical Role just in general. So, if you aren't caught up, I recommend getting caught up before watching this video. So, one last warning, spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. In episode 119 of Campaign 3 of Critical Role, the Bells, Hells, and the Matron Ravens finally came together to make a decision as to what they were going to do with the gods as it comes to the Predathos predicament, and they chose to make the gods mortal. Now, the reason they did this is because when Imogen was fused with Predathos, she could see through its eyes, and she saw that Predathos didn't see mortals, only Rudisborn, which, yes, are mortal, but only Rudisborn and the gods hidden away in their golden realms. So this meant to Imogen, at the very least, that mortals will be safe from Predathos' wrath. They're not going to be eaten, and they're not going to be consumed, and they're safe. Exandria, for the most part, would be safe. Which means if the gods were to be mortal, like they were in Downfall, they would be safe, and Predathos would likely have to move on somewhere else to find and feed on whatever it needs to find and feed on. And last week I talked about the potential outcomes that this decision would have, all the changes that would happen to the world, and the cool, interesting storylines that could come from it. However, there was one notable exception to this that I didn't talk about because I honestly thought it fit into that video pretty well without me having to mention it, and that was Vaxildan. What is going to happen now to Vaxildan? Now, in that video a week ago, I did mention that I think the creatures or, entities that are of lesser divinity, or celestials, angels, and other things along those lines, and how I believe they would be dealt with, which was they would be relatively the same, as we did see them in Downfall a little bit. There was a handful of angels who appeared in Downfall, and they seemed to be relatively the same as in regards to what they should be strength-wise, compared to the gods at the very least, who were able to basically just clap them no problem. But they were still around, they didn't die, they didn't disappear, they didn't have to go into some sort of sleep. They were still around and able to do things. In fact, they were the ones largely in charge of the war at the time during Downfall. So, I believed that this would be the same with Vax. As in the Tal'Dorei Reborn guide, he is actually classified as a Celestial. So realistically to me, I just decided he was going to be able to slide right into that. But that isn't very fun from a story perspective as to what this main character of a, entire campaign would be going through after his, god becomes mortal. So let's assume that this plan goes through and that the gods do decide to become mortal again like they were in Downfall. Now, there are two different ways that I could see things going for Vax, and they start relatively the same and eventually splinter off. So the way that I can see it going down, if the gods agree, is Vax is allowed to just exist on Exandria for a while, because he's going to have to be wherever the reincarnation of the Raven Queen will end up. So with this being said, we know that Pervan was able to eventually find Amira, which was the human form of the Raven Queen back before the Downfall situation. So with that being said, I think Vax can find her as well, and then take her to Zephyra, or him, depending on what happens. But I believe that the Raven Queen's new form will be able to be taken to Zephyra by Vax, where he will be able to live until she remembers who she is. And then when she remembers who she is where things become a little difficult and becomes a little too fanficky for me to be able to properly write out a character and how it's going to move forward. But I do think that there's a good chance that, much like how Amira wanted to deal with her things on her own without Pervan standing over her shoulder, I feel like whatever this new reincarnation of the god will be, will want to do the same with Vax. Be able to live her own life and go out and experience her own adventure without the, protection of this extremely powerful individual just standing over her shoulder constantly. And with that, and the time that it would likely take for her to remember who she is, Vax can live a life again with Keyleth. He can potentially have a kid with her, or multiple kids. He can train other people to protect this new version of the Raven Queen, so even when she's a kid, he doesn't have to be with her 24/7. He can take other people, kind of like how Derek made a bunch of Orums, or like other versions of Derek. So realistically, I get the feeling that Zephyr will not only just have an extremely high level group of people who can just protect Keyleth all the time, we could also see a group of people who can protect the Raven Queen all the time. Now, there's a chance that, Keyleth isn't a big, on the idea of having the Raven Queen here, but something tells me Vax would be able to convince her otherwise, because that means they can stick together and stay close. But I can possibly see a future where, the new version of the Raven Queen and Vax just travel the world together, where it's just the two of them after, she remembers who she is and she wants to go on an adventure, but she doesn't want to travel in a big group. I can see that happening too. That's why I think like this area gets into a little bit too much of a fanficky sort of style of writing for a character, but I do think it's an interesting sort of idea that either one, she wants to do her own thing, or two, she wants Vax with her, which is a very real possibility. I think the real question for what happens to Vax happens sort of when the mortal version of the Raven Queen were to die. Now, this is where things start to splinter. If the Raven Queen, this new version of the Raven Queen, is able to reincarnate in some way, like they can constantly reincarnate over and over again, I don't see why Vax would be affected. If he wasn't affected here by the first reincarnation, I don't see why he wouldn't be able to just continue to do it over and over again. And seeing as how Celestials don't die, he could effectively be an immortal protector of the Raven Queen forever on Exandria, and constantly be the one to protect the new form of Exandria, which would work really well because Keyleth is also effectively immortal, which means two members of Vox Machina will just forever exist on Exandria, which I think would be a lot of fun and would be really cool. And it would mean, yeah, sure, sometimes they spend 50 years apart from each other, but 50 years is nothing in their eyes, as their lifespan is, much longer than that. Vax being basically immortal, aside from, potentially being killed off in combat in some form or fashion, he can't die of age, and Keyleth has an extremely long lifespan now as well. I think the number consistently changes, so I'm just not going to bother trying to say exactly what it is. I think I've heard multiple thousands of years, and then I've heard 1,000 years, so a bunch of different lifespans for her. But I can eventually see a point where Vax would be like, you know what? Keyleth's going to go soon. I'm going to go with her. You're going to have to pick a different champion. Very realistic a possibility, but I do like the idea of the two of them effectively being century-year-old protectors of Zephyra and the Raven Queen. I think that's a lot of fun and would be really cool to see them pop up throughout multiple stories, like Campaign 7, where it's 1,000 years later and the two of them are still around. Some sort of unrealistic shit like that, which I think would be really cool and really fun, because it means even after all the shit that they went through and the 30 plus years of pain that the two of them had to go through, they can now basically live on together for a long time and be happy. And then there's the outcome in which the Raven Queen can't be reincarnated, and this version or this soul of the Raven Queen will eventually die, and either the power has to be passed on to someone else, or the power just disappears altogether, which is a possibility. Which means, to me, because of the way that Vax is sort of tied to her and how he was brought back to life by her, means there's a possibility that he, in fact, dies, where he no longer gets to exist because his connection to the living is gone. Even though he is a Celestial now, theoretically, he might just be that in title. We're not too sure. But it is likely that if she were to go away completely, like the soul of the Raven Queen were to be gone and the power of the Raven Queen, the ruler of fate and death, if she were to go, that means Vax would likely also end up going. So if she can't reincarnate or she can't pass the powers on, I do see a world in which Vax doesn't get to have this, millennia-long love story with Keyleth. But who knows? This is the shorter version because there's not really that much detail to go into, but I do think it's rather interesting to think about these two possibilities. One where he gets to live on as long as he wants as the protector of the Raven Queen as long as she can reincarnate, or two, he only gets to live one more lifespan, and that is tied with the Raven Queen's lifespan, which I think both are far more compelling than him having to be some sort of lapdog and occasionally jump between the two realms to be able to communicate with people. I think it's much more interesting that he now gets to have a chance to live for a while on the material plane. Now, I did mention something earlier that I kind of want to bring up because I think the idea is interesting, but Keyleth and Vax having a child. To me, this is interesting for a couple of reasons, because with him being a Celestial and her being, an elf, does that mean, the child would be some sort of Asimar, some sort of, half angel type being, because he is theoretically a Celestial? Or do you think because he's a half elf and she's a half elf, it would just end up being a half elf again? I'm curious to know what you guys would think about that one, because I think it would be really cool if their child was an Asimir as opposed to being a half elf, which would, separate them from the rest of the family. There's the whole Dorolo side of the family, which has their black sheep in it, obviously, but then the rest of them are just, half elves. It would be really interesting for me to see two half elf parents having an Asimar, because technically the one is a Celestial. So I'm curious what you guys think about that possibility of what exactly their child would look like which I think would be really fun and really interesting. Kind of how I've always wondered about how what Ford and Jester's Child would be like. Some sort of half-orc tiefling hybrid. It would be really interesting and really fun to eventually see that, but, you know, maybe one day. So at the end of the day, what do I think is going to happen to Vax? I think he's finally going to be able to have some sort of happy ending after defending Exandria against Vecna, the Whispered One, alongside the rest of his friends and family, which is cool. For me, at the very least, eventually seeing a happy story or a story come to a happy ending is always nice. I know a lot of people aren't, big on that because not everyone gets a happy ending in real life or whatever, but this ain't real life. I'd rather see a bunch of characters have a fun, fulfilling story that's told out in and this is still a compelling way. I don't think this sort of destroys anything that's happened before. It builds upon it. The fact that we've now, been able to work towards a reasonable solution to bringing Vax back to the mortal plane instead of just, for the last 30 years, I've just chosen not to be here, which was basically what was kind of being set up by the end of the whole Vox Machina fight in Campaign 3. But then she gave him the time limit of one afternoon or one night, which now seems to be completely blown out of the water. But I digress. I do think it is a lot more fun for them to be able to have this sort of ending for the character of Vax, which means when they eventually animate Campaign 3, that character arc will be able to sort of come full circle again, which I think would be really cool and really fun to see animated. So yeah, overall, what do I think is going to happen to Vax? He's going to get his happy ending. But that's just what I think. I want to know what you guys think. Do you think that, what I said is true and that he's going to get his happy ending? Or do you think something else is going to happen when the Raven Queen goes away and becomes someone else? Will that connection be severed between the two of them? And will he die? Will he disappear? Will he have to be reborn somehow? I'm curious to know what you guys think. And yeah, I'll see you guys on Friday for whatever video I make next. It'll likely be a video discussing the State of the Role video that Critical Role is going to come out with soon. I don't know when that's going to be out specifically, but I am definitely going to be talking about whatever they reveal there, because apparently it's going to be important for the future of Critical Role as, an online show to watch and enjoy. So I'm very curious as to what they're going to say this week, and I'm definitely going to make a video about it. So I will see you guys on Friday with that video. And until then, peace.